All right, here we go, you accursed. Because of a couple of real-life, real-work scheduling commitments, we're down to a Kory, Teneycke, David Herle political panel today. But don't you worry even a little bit. Scott and Jordan will be back next week. So that means it's down to me today to represent the progressive, liberal, NDP, unkempt hair, hand-rolled cigarette point of view. And as always, Kory will be speaking to the conservative bet you wish you could look as good as I do in a turtleneck worldview.
And I didn't wear a turtleneck today. God, I'm totally missing my cue.
Missing your cue. And here's the rundown this week. Our cursed clipping is Don Braid's piece in the Calgary Herald about Danielle Smith's Sovereignty Act and the inherent political miscalculations in that. There's a by-election in Mississauga Lakeshore next Monday, and there are only about 40 candidates running. We'll talk about the outcome, speculate on the outcome there a little bit and what it might mean. The gun issue is getting hot again, with a rather high-profile voice entering the fray. We'll chat about that. And then the economy and inflation. Is any party winning the battle to convince us that they have some answers? And we'll bring it to a close with Gordon and our Hey Yous. Hey, Kory, my friend, thank you for being here with me. Otherwise, Curse of Politics would have turned into a hurly-burly, and we don't want that brand confusion out there.
There you go. Yeah, it's not a panel as much as a conversation, but we like having those, David, so it's a natural fit.
Yeah. How you been? How was your weekend?
I had an amazing weekend. I took my oldest son, Marcus, to New York City for the weekend to kind of...
Holy shit.
He's coming to the end of grade 12 and did really well at school this year and got into university. And so this is a dad-son weekend to mark the moment appropriately. And so it was really, really nice. Very crowded, though. The only time I've been in New York and seen bigger crowds on the streets were the one year I went for New Year's Eve. But it was crazy busy, but crazy fun, too.
I loved New York in December, right?
Yeah.
I love it in December. Everything, the weather, the atmosphere in the town, the way they decorate it up. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it was a bit rainy, but but not unbearably so. And although the people skating in Rockefeller Center on the ice there looked more like water skiing than it did look like skating. But it was it was really, really.
What's
nice.
The most fun thing you did?
Probably as simple as it sounds, just walking through Central Park. I love that park so much. It's such an organic part of that city and the life of the people that live there that it's just sort of fun to soak up the atmosphere and enjoy the beauty of it.
Have you ever been to the zoo?
Yeah. Not this time, but I have in the past.
Yeah. Penguins in Central Park. It's strange.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's, But a very cool place. I think the lineup to get into the MoMA was like 2 hours. So, it wasn't a good weekend to do those kinds of sites. But, the shopping was on full throttle. So if there's a recession going on, it wasn't evident on Fifth Avenue.
The two things I always used to do when I went to New York City was go to Tower Records and go to the Strand bookstore. And Tower Records is now closed, and the Strand bookstore probably not far behind it if it's still open. But
yeah,
oh well.
It's a changing world out there, especially on the bookstore front. We were lamenting that the other day.
Hey there! Next Monday there's a by-election in Mississauga Lakeshore, and everybody seems to be throwing what they've got at it. The Liberals have had cabinet ministers and MPs rolling through there to be door knocking and mobilizing volunteers. I know a lot of Conservatives have been there as well. I got to acknowledge to you, Kory, I don't know anything about fucking by-elections. I never understood, and I probably should have conceded this to Paul and Kathleen and others before they put me in this position. I don't know how the government wins a by-election. Like, what is the point? How do you galvanize people in a stable governing situation to come out and endorse the government? So I never really knew how to run them. But this group has done pretty well in by-elections, the Trudeau people. So, and it's a good seat. I think you'll point out that the Conservatives only won it in 2011, and I will point out back that that's the only majority you've won. So it might be a bellwether riding in terms of whether the Conservatives can get to majority or not. But do you see any upset happening there next week?
No, not really. I think that The Liberals have a very strong candidate. Sousa is, well known in the area. It was probably one of the closest seats that we won in the GTA in the last provincial election, and we barely won it in 2018 as well. It's a very, very difficult riding, and the Conservatives have held it once federally in 35 years, so it's not an easy seat. It's too bad Jenny isn't on today, because for the Conservative side of campaigning, I think she has the winningest record for by-elections of any Conservative campaign manager. She managed many of them through the Harper years successfully, including getting Aaron O'Toole elected when he first joined. But it's a tough seat, and I think if she was on, she would score the odds of winning it as quite slim. Candidates, what makes it better for a by-election? You need to have a really strong local candidate, and I think it's like one of the things. I think the Liberals certainly have one in terms of profile and local support. It'll be tough, but it'll be interesting to see. So I don't think it's whether it's winning or losing. I think the Conservatives are going to lose. I think it's how close is it, and what are the underlying demographics, which is not maybe a perfect bellwether for what's going to happen in a general election, but it demonstrates, I think, a little bit on the demographic side who has more enthusiasm, and you might be able to read a little bit in those tea leaves. But overall, by-elections, I don't think matter a whole lot one way or another. They're more important in the day-to-day media spin of what's going on.
But when the anger at the government's white hot, you can't win them, right?
It's not white. It's not white hot in the GTA.
Yeah. Right.
There's two areas of the country, I guess three if we want to include the Maritimes, where there's still a significant amount of support for the government. Anger's white hot, in parts of British Columbia, but it's in the interior. It's not in the Lower Mainland, and it's white hot on the prairies, obviously, but it's not white hot in the GTA. It's an area where I think the government continues to enjoy a fairly significant amount of support. But that's going to be, I think, the challenge for the Conservatives going into the next election. I know we're going to talk a little bit about economic messaging later in the podcast, so I'll maybe reserve some comments for then. But trying to get the issue set right for and frame the debate correctly in that part of the country is, as is always the case, going to decide who's government.
Yeah, well, some of these other issues, we may loop back to this by-election when we get into some of these other issues, because some of them, both guns and the economy, may be having some impact in that riding as they raise their profile. Let's talk about guns. And I'm just going to defer to you right away. I assume you know more about this than I do, because I think you've shot a gun in your life. And in seriousness, you're a hunter, right?
Yeah.
You're a hunter, and I'm not a hunter, and I'm not familiar with guns. I probably wasn't going to be that interested in this subject until Kory Price popped his head up and intervened in the debate, and that sort of got my attention. First of all, because he was holding what looked to be a pretty standard hunting weapon, and that if that was going to be banned, well, that would be curious. But so my understanding is that the weapon he's holding in his picture is not going to be banned under the legislation, but it is also my understanding that a lot of weapons that are used conventionally in hunting and by farmers to protect their property from coyotes, wolves, feral hogs, wild turkeys, whatever, are going to be banned because they've got semi-automatic capacity or can be altered to have semi-automatic capacity. So the government's all in on this. They proposed amendments that have got everybody up in arms. The ministers doubled down on it. Poilievre's come out against these changes, as have some New Democrats like Charlie Angus have come out against these changes. So the political battle is engaged I presume the NDP are going to be split on this, but the political battle between the Liberals and Conservatives is engaged. And are there any votes at stake here? As we go further down this gun control road, are there still votes to be gotten here one way or another, or are both sides just playing their greatest hits to their fans?
I think there's a bit of a greatest hits element to it. But I also think there's a darker component to this that is something that should be discouraged, I think, by both parties, which is sort of the tone deaf nature of the rural-urban divide in the country. Like, I think if we're looking at things that pull Canadians apart, this is one of the areas that where there's a lot of tension. Like, this is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to get elected in rural areas in the country for the Liberals. I don't think having governments where everybody's from rural areas and very few people are from cities is good for the country. And I don't think it's very good for the country to have political parties ruling that have no one in rural areas. Like, it's a divide that's more meaningful than probably any other divide that you could if you're just to say, all right, this is a rural riding or an urban riding. It's more important than any other underlying demographic factors or things that we could point out to put a riding in one category or another. And that's unfortunate. There was a time when, people like Ralph Goodale represented the rural area in the great province of Saskatchewan. And I think having Goodale in cabinet and as a part of the government was healthy and positive in terms of having better policy outcomes and better initiatives that back the people in the province of Saskatchewan. I think that if Goodale was still around, this wouldn't have happened. But I think it's emblematic of a government that just doesn't have any voices around the cabinet table or in positions of importance that understand that changes like this are very divisive. The other thing that I don't think a lot of people understand is the way our firearms laws work right now. To possess a banned firearm, can put you, I guess some of the mandatory minimums have been struck down, but, absent that, a 3-year mandatory minimum prison sentence, like that's a federal prison sentence. And you're talking about hundreds of thousands of Canadians that own firearms that would fall into these categories. We only have about 15,000 federal prisoners in Canada right now, and that's probably a good thing. But, you're talking about criminalizing a huge swath of the country for something that is basically an administrative crime, something that is just, an edict that by a stroke of a pen, you are putting a huge number of people offside with the law. And, even if you phase in implementation and all these things, like I think it's a very high-handed and arbitrary approach to an issue. And I think it's a very questionable effectiveness in terms of doing anything with crime. Like, where? Well, why do you see it by these?
I've got my glow on, Herle Burleyites. Nope, not that kind of glow. It's the glow I typically feel as the calendar rolls into December. The most wonderful time of the year, as the song says, giving season. Not that I think of giving necessarily as a season, but this time of year, it's part of the brand. You all know that our presenting sponsor is Telus. As a company built from day one with a social purpose, giving is a core value with them, happening 365 days a year. Core values don't take any days off, eh? Giving comes in thousands of forms with Telus. A rather influential one is the Telus Friendly Future Foundation, an independent registered charity that believes all youth, regardless of circumstance, deserve an equal opportunity to reach their full potential. It was launched in 2018 with an endowment from Telus to support its admin costs forevermore. You'll pardon the rhetorical flourish, just emphasizing that the foundation will always direct every single penny of every single donation it receives to local charities in Canada. Over 500 charities each year providing education and health programs, many enabled by technology. Over 2 million youth in communities across Canada are being helped. The foundation has 2 unique programs. Local community board grants provide grants up to $20,000 to local youth charities. and innovation grants, providing multi-year funding of up to $200,000 for breakthrough ideas in youth mental health or environmental education and climate action programs for youth. In 2022 alone, and it's not over yet, there have been 548 grants adding up to more than $10.5 million. Since 2018, over $35 million in grants. Remember when I said giving wasn't only a season for Telus? We'll tell you some of these Friendly Future Foundation giving stories in the next few weeks. But for now, you can learn more about it at friendlyfuture.com. Okay, so wait a second. And I'm just going to push back on this a little bit because, so first of all, I agree with you culturally. I totally agree with you on the cultural divide that's out there. And people in rural Canada increasingly have no idea what it's like to live in rural Canada and what the culture's like and what you do for recreation, what you do for sustenance in some cases. In the area where I have my cottage, the people around here hunt for their food. Like it's not just a sport to them, although it is a sport. But it helps get them through the winter. Like they bag a moose and it matters. So, and I don't think urban people understand that part of the culture at all. And I think actually most people that are in favor of stricter gun control are probably in favor of gun elimination. Don't understand why we should have guns in Canada. So that cultural divide is real. On the other hand, so I was reading that if you have an automatic weapon, I know, and most gun crime is handgun crime committed by gangs in major cities, and that's
with illegal guns.
With illegal guns,
they're all illegal.
I understand that, but when somebody pops up in a schoolroom or in a École Polytechnique, they pop up with a semi-automatic weapon. And so what I was reading is you can get about 30 rounds a minute out of a semi-automatic weapon. So yes, you've got to, at one hand, understand people use these things to protect their livestock. People use these things when they're hunting, but they can also be used for mass murder.
Right, but so can a truck. Like, and we've had examples of that also. Like, I just fail to see the logic of this, David. Like, murder is very illegal. Like, there are lots of things that are very illegal. Just saying that something is illegal doesn't eliminate it. Saying, oh, well, we're going to ban all guns. Guess what? There are lots of countries in the world where that is the position. Guess what else happens in those countries? Gun crime. Because if you're a criminal and, you're going to commit murder or you're going to use a firearm to enforce a contract, if you're a drug dealer or what have you, you don't give a flying fuck what the prohibition on gun ownership is. Like the punishments for that is high as they are in Canada and other countries as well, are pale in comparison to the use of that firearm in a crime, whether it's an armed robbery, whether it's to commit a murder, it's, I don't know, it's like the League of Nations wanting to ban war and outlaw it. Just because you say something like that doesn't mean that that's the policy outcome on the other side. So it's, I think it's for people who are in rural areas and people who are firearms owners, it just seems like you're being targeted culturally and in a way that is very arbitrary, and it has not, your firearms ownership has nothing to do with handgun crime in a handful of neighborhoods in Toronto. Like there's no correlation between A and B. Thankfully, mass shootings are not a big part of the Canadian experience, and let's hope that continues. But I don't think that the reason why we don't have a lot of that in Canada is about firearms ownership, because firearms ownership in Canada is one of the highest in the world. Like, I don't think, some of our listeners would appreciate just, on relative basis, how many people own firearms in Canada versus other countries. It's very high. The polling data would indicate that people who support gun legislation also see it as a cultural thing more than they see it as a crime thing, because I've pointed out this interesting twist a couple of times, which is that
if you ask people which party better reflects their views on gun control, most Canadians will say the Liberal Party over the Conservative Party. But if you ask people which party is more likely to be effective against crime, most people will say the Conservative Party and not the Liberal Party. So there's not a direct correlation between taking action on guns and being seen to be tough on crime. In fact, they're almost, in a sense, unrelated to each other. It's more that people who support gun control support it out of cultural reasons rather than support it because they see it as a significant measure to reduce crime.
I agree with those statements. But I think that's what this is. It's not just a dog whistle. I think it's an air horn to the Liberal base to try to frame an election around some values issues, and that's not unusual. We've talked about that on the podcast many times, so it's throwing out some red meat for your own supporters. But it is it.
Well, it's also a trap, policy? Isn't it, Kory? Is it also not a trap? Because Poilievre rose to the fight. Poilievre rose to the fight, and this election, this issue, perhaps more than any other, cost O'Toole the last election. When they made when they released their platform and it had those gun measures in it, and the Liberals went after them. I tested some of the Liberal advertising in focus groups, and when people saw the pictures of the guns that the Liberals put up, that the Conservatives were proposing to make legal, people would recoil in their seat from that. Like that looked like a dangerous weapon to them, and it in the absence of any other compelling issue, which that election didn't have, it sort of became a bit of a litmus test for how you saw the world, whose side you were on, all that kind of stuff. So it assumed a lot of importance. This is probably, as the Conservatives try to break into new territory, a tricky issue for them.
I think it is, and it's for exactly that reason. But I guess maybe it's. We usually are fairly cynical about politics on this podcast because that's the nature of the business. But I think it's really unfortunate, and I think we can be too cynical in some of the things that we throw in the window as issues. We talked about the drug issue last week, and I view that as a similar sort of issue where you get put in the window by Conservatives in a similar fashion, and it's really more about a values issue, and maybe the policy underlying it isn't very well conceived. But all of the outrage about that from the Liberal world, there's a mirror version of that around the firearms issue for the Conservative world, and that's what you're seeing play out here. Like you're seeing some of these cultural issues being put in the window for political gain. It's maybe good politics, but it's very cynical politics. But I think in both cases, there's some pretty bad policy that underlies it.
I wonder if the Liberals think they need it as a hedge against the NDP to keep some people from drifting over.
Yeah, well, I think it revs up your base, but it helps to frame the issue around values, which I think for the Liberals is a tried and true approach to campaigning, and it's one that is going to help them in the GTA, which is, as we just talked about, I think where the election will be largely decided.
I want to talk for a minute about an unsexy, plain brown, unprepossessing thing that has nonetheless managed to acquire iconic status in the Canadian institutional memory. The railroad boxcar. We've all seen them at some point, usually so many bolted together behind a locomotive that you can't see the end of the train. Every kid on the prairies and quite a few elsewhere in Canada has squirmed in the back seat of the family sedan at a rail crossing, watching a solid wall of those rectangular brown cuboids, yes, that's the geometric term, clicking by for what seemed like forever. Boxcars have looked basically the same for nearly 200 years. That timelessness has made them famous, Bandits chased them in westerns. Hobos jumped onto them in the 30s. Stuntmen leaped out of their sliding doors in movies. And over the decades, they transported just about everything, everywhere. Our sponsor, CN, operated wooden boxcars during the company's early years, 30,000 of them at one point. They were eventually ruled fire hazards and phased out. In the 50s, the railway began using steel boxcars. One particular fleet was nicknamed Buffalo Cars because of the Manitoba buffalo image each one displayed. They were originally used to move newsprint, then modified to haul grain to Churchill and Thunder Bay. The arrival of specialized hopper cars in the second half of the last century removed the grain mission from boxcars, but they remain in use for just about everything else. Modern boxcars are bigger and more sophisticated, often refrigerated or cushioned. CN is actually acquiring 800 new ones, 60 feet long, high capacity, and yes, still brown. It might seem a little counterintuitive to be spending millions expanding capacity like that in a period of economic uncertainty, but CN believes that constant reinvestment in the railroad, regardless of the economic cycle, is wise. Massive disruptions to supply chains in Europe and Asia are putting pressure on Canadian producers, and governments in North America are talking a lot about nearshoring, and there's a severe shortage of truckers. So CN needs more boxcars and keeps buying more for forest products, or metals, or minerals, or auto parts, or bagged agricultural products, or whatever. Because, as I've said here a few times, cargo has to move, and boxcars just keep rolling. All right, let's move on. Let's move west. Let's move west to our clipping of the day. Our clipping of the day, which comes to us from Don Braid in the Calgary Herald. And Don Braid was writing about the Sovereignty Act and of the government, and he's referring, where I start off this section of the article, he's referring to something that the mayor of Calgary had said about possibly the impacts of being directed by the government to not obey federal legislation. And he said, she's talking about the threat to independence of elected councils and arm's length authorities. They get provincial funding, every one, but they have wide latitude to set goals and take action. Often they seek funding from both the province and Ottawa. Usually they are left to do the job expected of them. The Sovereignty Act is a direct threat to that traditional measure of independence. It can weaponize every group that accepts a provincial penny, enlisting them in a provincial battle that's no part of their business. The Sovereignty Act was mythical until it hit the legislature Monday. People and agencies all over the province were shocked to suddenly learn that they are the only foot soldiers in Smith's battle. Here's the list of organizations that must comply: a regional health authority, a public post-secondary school, a school board, a municipality, a municipal or regional police service, provincial public agencies, provincial crown-controlled organizations, entities that carry out a provincial power, duty, or function, entities that receive public funds contingent on providing a public service. The pressure is on the Premier, he concludes. The pressure is on the Premier. Her own troops, conscripted suddenly, are uneasy. So, Kory, I just do not see how this piece of legislation fits in any plan that you would concoct to try to win the next election for the UCP. I just don't understand the politics of this. I mean, it seemed to me evident for a long time now that the game is Calgary, that they've got the rural locked up. The NDP won't be able to penetrate there. Edmonton's a fortress for the NDP, and the game is Calgary. Mm-hmm. And this, I had Janet Brown, who is an Alberta pollster on, and I looked at her poll, and yeah, Albertans are frustrated about the Federation. They're unhappy about the way equalization works. They think this federal government's hostile to Alberta. That's all true. But their priorities for government were the blocking and tackling of provincial governments, healthcare, education, road quality. I mean, this is what's on the minds of Albertans right now, inflation. And so this just seems like a wildly secondary fight that is going to make a sophisticated city like Calgary think this is a bonkers government that isn't even focused on the right stuff. So to me, this is the biggest opening into Calgary that they could have given Notley. And unless the entire plan is to suck the feds into the fight, I do not understand the politics of this play.
Yeah, I don't either. To be frank, it's I thought even prior to the details coming out that this was unconservative, fundamentally unconservative in its nature. We're supposed to be about respect for institutions and evolutionary change, not revolutionary change. I think that the push to have the Constitution recognized and to have laws follow the Constitution, like these are very conservative notions. The idea of disobeying courts and taking an approach that is fundamentally unconstitutional is really perplexing to me. This is French Revolution, not Edmund Burke stuff. So I find it a puzzling position for a conservative to take to begin with. But that being said, just looking at the politics, there aren't enough votes in this. There is an audience for it for sure, but it's an audience that the UCP already has sewn up. So, you should be doing a play for your shoulder voters right now, for the people who are, still making up their mind as to whether or not they're going to vote for the NDP or for the UCP. And the concerns that you're seeing in the publicly available polling is around the UCP, chasing these riding these ideological hobby horses around, as opposed to focusing on meat and potatoes issues around the economy and affordability and jobs. I don't know why they're not focusing more on that. We saw a little bit of that from them with the payments that they made to bring their surplus down a bit and to help people with affordability. I think that was probably a good strategy. At least it was on topic on those things that are more concerned to swing voters. But this is doubling down on your base, and there'd be times where that might be smart if you thought you were trying to save the furniture, or you had a vulnerability with what is normally a core constituency of yours. But that's not really what we're seeing lining up in this campaign. So I think they got to get back on topic around the economy. They should have a perpetual advantage.
How do you drive swing
issues.
voters away from the NDP, Kory? You make the election about the economy.
Yeah,
if the election's about the economy, that's the weakest ground the NDP can ever be fighting on.
Well, I'd say crime's up there too. I'd say that's another one. This is back to our earlier conversation. I think there are things around drug policy and things like that probably push more moderate voters towards the Conservatives, and where they're viewed as having more credibility on these issues. So I don't think there's a lack of issues out there for Danielle to be putting in the window. I just think this is one that's more of an ideological hobby horse. There's no sign that the feds are going to take the bait on it either. Romeo LeBlanc was out in the past week saying, look, we're not going to waste Dominic. Sorry, jeez, whoops. But saying that they're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Basically, they're going to not take up the fight, which makes it even more difficult, I think, for this approach to work, if it was ever going to work at all. And I'm skeptical.
By the way, Dominic would not be remotely insulted. It is his life's greatest ambition to be his father. So he will have been pleased to have been. He'll be pleased to have been compared.
Well, he's. If we want to talk about him for a quick moment, for other first ministers, obviously I spend most of my time talking with Premier Ford, but for other first ministers who I speak with. He has a very, very good reputation with the premiers as being accessible and responsive. That doesn't mean that they agree. They often disagree very vigorously, but he does hold their respect, and that's not an easy thing to do.
He's just such a good shit. It's really hard to dislike him, right?
Yeah. I think that's the widely held opinion. That
criminally funny as well. criminally funny guy as well. Okay, back to Danielle Smith. So I just want to impose on your knowledge a little bit, if you have any, about this, which is I watched her do a few public appearances this week, and she looks to me like she's completely out there on her own, just winging it, just saying what's on her mind, feeling like she's on top of the world. She's won the premiership, and I'll just go and tell David Cochrane how it works. And but is that what's actually going? Is it as slipshod as it looks? Or is there actually a professional team of political operators back there working around her that are doing quality public opinion research and are trying to direct her in the right? Is there a professional operation there around this premier, or is she just out there gunslinging?
Well, I don't think it's A or B, but I do think there's a very evident lack of discipline. And Danielle, on the positive side, is a very personable, charming person. Like when you meet with her and speak with her, she seems very reasonable, and there's definitely charisma there. But I think when you've spent a lot of time being a talk radio host, etc., what you're rewarded in doing is kind of letting it all hang out and swinging for the fences in your responses, and because that's what makes good media. But it's not what makes good politics, as you know. That is message discipline, and sometimes the right approach is to be boring and not make news. You don't want to answer every question with the pithiest, cleverest, most quote-worthy answer that you possibly can. Often the discipline of politics is to be fucking dull. Like, remember our friend Herb Gray. The gray fog would descend upon question period, and he would just stand up and in a very boring tone say, Mr. Speaker, I reject the premise of the honorable member's question, blah, 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 blah.
One of the most famous quotes in Canadian politics comes from Bill Davis when he said, "Bland works."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, like it's, you want to, having pithy, smart, quotable answers can work too, but it's got to be on the topics that you really want to engage on. And to have that discipline is something that many, many political leaders don't have. And the ones that are the most successful are the ones that can master that art. And it is an art.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the last thing I thought we'd talk about today, Kory, is something that I'm increasingly interested in, which is the economic news is largely unremittingly bad. So inflation continues to charge away. There's news reports out today that the cost of food for an average family will go up $1,000 over the next year. That's a lot of money for most Canadians to just come out of their disposable income. Interest rates are getting higher, causing increasing carnage in the housing market, as it would. Hasn't really started to bite on economic growth yet, but they're going to raise rates again this week. And they're intending to bite on economic activity. And so maybe we're going to have a recession. But in any event, interest rates are climbing higher. Inflation is still high. And I don't really see any of this reflected in voting behavior. And I have seen in past lives, when a recession comes along, when the economy goes bad, that the government goes into the shitter. And something is holding this government above the shit line, even in this bad economy. And so I guess I'm curious about whether you think it's that tribalism is so strong now, that partisanship is so strong now that there's less shifting that goes on, even in reaction to things like these kind of economic incidents, or whether the opposition is actually really failing to hit the mark and convince people that they've got a better idea and that things would actually be any better if they took charge. Because this is certainly the type of environment in which people start looking around for change normally.
Yeah, well, a few things. One, we're not in a recession yet. So that's, we're talking about that, the economy being really bad and everything. It's not evident that it is. Like there's anxiety around interest rates. There's anxiety around the cost of living increasing. Like there's some economic anxiety out there, but we're not in a recession right now. And so I think the tale is yet to be told in terms of what the public reaction will be when that happens, if it happens. But I do think some of the other things you mentioned there are very true, and we've seen them not just in this federal environment right now, but in virtually every province, and we've seen it in other countries as well, where it is more tribal, and that most parties have a higher floor. Like for your main parties of the left and the right, they have a higher floor and a lower ceiling. And the number of swing voters that are out there to be convinced or that will move during an election is smaller than we've ever seen it. And I think that's those aren't waves on the water. That's a tide that's coming in, and there's not a lot that anybody can do to fight back against an incoming tide. That's just, I think, maybe not a permanent part of our political environment, but it's certainly one that's increasing and is going to be prevalent for the foreseeable future. However, I think there's one other component to this, and that is just voter turnout. And I think more than swing voters, the name of the game now is getting non-voters, who are have a very marginal interest in politics. Low information voters, disengaged voters. There's lots of different ways that we can describe them. Right. But engaging those folks and giving them a compelling reason to come to the polls is really the difference between a really good campaign and one that falls a bit flat. And we've seen examples from different parties being able to do that effectively. Like I think if we go back to 2015, Trudeau getting millennials to vote largely on the marijuana legalization issue in numbers that prior to that has not happened. So I think that's the trick, and so what issues are going to do that? I still think that at the end of the day, the economy is going to be the central issue, and we'll see whether which party can get them out. I think the best issue out there to increase that engagement level and get some of those less engaged voters out is going to be around housing affordability and housing availability. Because it touches on millennials and new Canadians to such a high degree compared to other demographics. And those are two pots of voters that often don't come out in as high numbers as, say, retirees.
Right. Well, I mean, that, the turnout issue is obviously becoming, the critical battleground as people become less movable. From one party to another. But does that mean that waves of change are gone? I mean, I hesitate to say that, having been involved in the 2018 provincial campaign. I think waves of change can still exist. But are you not surprised at how well the government support is holding up?
Yes and no. Like the right track, wrong direction numbers
would indicate that their polling support would be worse.
Are pretty concerning, and those I think those are a leading indicator. I think political support comes later. I would say the Emergencies Act inquiry for the last several weeks, many weeks, has been actually the dominant political story that's floating around out there in the political press, and that is not a favorable story for the Conservatives overall, and that 2/3 of Canadians support the imposition of the Emergencies Act. And so I think that storyline was generally favorable for the Liberals. And we're not in a recession yet. So I think there's a bunch of things going on, but I wouldn't be resting on my laurels here if I were the Liberals, because I think the fundamentals underlying this are trending towards the Conservatives overall. And just the age of the government. Like as you know, there are patterns in politics for a reason. Like and to blink those away is to really put hope ahead of history in terms of what the outcomes are. government's getting a little long in the tooth, and the enemies have accumulated, and all those pebbles that you're carrying around in your backpack, and you toss another one in every day, that are starting to get pretty heavy.
Yeah, you said something really interesting there, which is we're not in a recession, and I wonder if both here and in the United States the political impact of inflation has been overstated, because the polls would certainly indicate that the cost of living and the rising cost of essentials are the number one issue for people, and that they're highly concerned about them. But it may be that this doesn't provoke the same kind of political change and anger that a recession does, with people losing their jobs and fearing losing their jobs, and so it's actually that the current track of Bank of Canada rate increases is a bigger threat to the government politically than the inflation itself was, which is probably why they hope they get it out of the way well before the next election. But the other thing you said is, one of the things that people really misinterpreted about the polls in the United States, and I haven't seen any analysis of this in Canada, is that people took assumptions from the right track, wrong track numbers in the United States and assumed that the Democrats were in for a pounding. What people didn't realize was that a significant chunk of the wrong track were people who intended to vote Democrat and thought the Republicans had the United States on the wrong track. So so wrong track didn't just mean I'm angry at the government and I think the party in power is doing things wrong. I think the country's headed in the wrong direction for reasons of the opposition and what's going on. And I wonder if there's any of that creeping in Canada as well, given the levels of polarization we've been talking about, whether there aren't liberals who look around at Poilievre, Smith, and Moe and say, I think the country's headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah, no, it's we're all going to hell in a handbasket vote. I think there's an element of that. I think also when we look south of the border in the midterms, it's what was on offer by the Republicans because of Trump's influence on the field of candidates and some of the issues that relitigating the last presidential election was not a good message to be campaigning on. So, you could think that Biden was on the wrong track. You could be discouraged by many things going on out there, but also think that the cure to those problems was not to elect a bunch of people to Congress and to governorships that just wanted to talk about what happened in the last presidential campaign. Like that's a poor offering. So, I think, what to do about all of this. I think if you're Pierre Poilievre, I think it's try to stay focused on solutions. Try not to, get too caught up in, hobby horse issues for your own tribe, and try to find a way to motivate some of these marginal voters who don't often turn up to the polls to actually get out there. And so, I think that's the name of the game, but, we'll see.
All right. Listen, this is probably as much as we can banter amongst the two of us this morning. Close to using up our hour, so why don't we move on to our Hey Yous? Gordon Pinsent, would you bring this thing to a conclusion for us?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
Kory, do you want to go first or second? Do you want to go first or bat cleanup?
I'll go first. So this is a Herle Burley crossover. As I listened to the Herle Burley most recent episode where you had a couple.
Thank you, by the way. I appreciate your support and patronage.
Well, I'm very invested in all of the air quotes media adventures here at this point. But you had Charlene Stewart as one of the guests on, and just for the audience, she's with SEIU, which is basically a healthcare union. I think they represent some other workers as well. But she said something that really got in my craw. She continually referred to the premier of Ontario as sexist and racist, like again and again. And I thought it was just a emblematic. I'm sure she's a very nice person. I don't know her at all. I have no axe to grind about her as an individual. But the use of that level of rhetoric, I think, is so unhelpful to our overall political discourse. And to, I think, and I don't think it represents one's members well, within the labor movement to take that kind of language. Premier of Ontario is certainly not sexist. And, I think he's more comfortable in a matriarchy than a patriarchy. He's got 4 daughters and a wife. And I think his mom is probably, if you were to ask him, the greatest person he's ever known in the world. All the major portfolios in the last administration, save finance, I guess, held by strong women, Christine Elliott and Caroline Mulroney. You have somebody who there's no indication that this is a sexist person. So I think it's ridiculous. And in terms of being a racist, like one of the most enduring features of the Ford political brand is how accessible it is to racial minorities and new Canadians. So imposing that kind, using that kind of rhetoric is just so superheated, and I find it very disappointing. And I think it's worth being called out. So my hey you is hey you, Charlene Stewart. Maybe try to tone it down a little bit and help make our discourse a little better, not a little worse. Okay.
Again, well, we got a feedback loop here between the hurly-burly and curse of politics. Awesome. My hey you goes out to Marco Mendicino. Minister, I know you to be a reasonable person. I know you to be a fact-driven person. I know you to be somebody that looks for consensus, and I know you to be a centrist. So I'm not second-guessing your judgment on this because I don't know enough about it, and it's very, very complicated. But given what I know about you, I would encourage you to take a second look at these amendments and everything that's going on and make sure that everything that you're doing is laser focused on public safety and not in any way a culture war for the purposes of having a culture war, because the country's too divided. The rural-urban gap is getting too severe, and we're like two solitudes, and urban wins all the time. And I think that there's a responsibility, and I'm channeling my inner Chris Arnaudy here, for us to think a little bit about people whose cultures and practices have always been legitimate, who have a slightly different lifestyle, but it's every bit as Canadian as ours. So, hey you, Marco, just take a second look at this, make sure it's all for the right reason. Okay, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsors, CN Rail. I'd like to thank Kory for at least showing up to talk to me today, Bugger, Jordan, and Scott. And I'd like to thank everybody who listened or watched, and we'll be back next week with more Curse of Politics and more people.